Hello, my name is Peter Remmers and I am a research assistant for philosophy at Technische Universität Berlin. In this video I'm presenting work that grew out of a collaboration with my colleague Pola Schwöbel from Technical University of Denmark in Copenhagen, who is a researcher in the field of machine learning. At the core of fair machine learning lies the question, what is fairness? To answer this question, a fundamental goal of this research is to define ethical standards for machine learning technologies and to help build tools that live up to such standards. This endeavor has become urgent in light of the rapid advancements within machine learning, which have enabled the widespread use of algorithmic decision-making. The stakes are high, both for society and for individuals, and some of these decision-making systems have already failed in dramatic and systematic ways. There are well-documented and much-discussed examples of racially biased algorithmic decision-making in the criminal justice system in the US, facial recognition failing on women of color, sexist hiring, and racist search engines. And these are only some notorious examples from the literature. Now, to measure the fairness of algorithms, formal metrics are constructed. In recent years, many such metrics have been proposed in the research on fairness. However, despite great efforts, there are still fundamental issues that the field has not been able to overcome. For example, formal contradictions between the fairness metrics for group fairness and individual fairness have been constructed as technical flaws of the metrics that seem unresolvable. To address issues like this one, we argue for a clarification of the roles of formal contributions and ethical debate in fair machine learning research. As noted by several researchers, issues like the formal contradiction of certain metrics are consequences of the tendency to conflate formal analysis of fairness with a discussion of ethical principles. While certain basic ideas of fairness are helpfully constructed as formal fairness metrics, these formalisms are then analyzed too narrowly without entering a non-formal ethical debate. We can conclude from this interpretation that while fair machine learning depends on formalizations, analysis of formalized criteria is not sufficient to determine the grounds for a choice between different criteria. Fair machine learning thus also depends on a comprehensive discussion of ethical goals and values. Consequently, a formalization strategy is needed that incorporates ethical considerations. In our paper, we discuss some fairness metrics and their weaknesses, a discussion that leads us to a further issue of current fairness debates. Formally constructed fairness criteria are often not sufficiently contextualized. For instance, the class of procedural fairness criteria generally works with the assumption that an unbiased decision process will sufficiently implement fairness. As a consequence, these criteria neither acknowledge nor adjust for biased data and are therefore susceptible to a reinforcement of existing inequalities. In contrast, the alternate class of outcome-based fairness criteria provides a more comprehensive approach. However, the standard outcome-based metrics usually fail to capture the development of structural differences between groups. This means that they do neither address the origins and causes of a given unfair distribution, nor the long-term effects of intervening in such a distribution. In the face of these issues, which we discuss in more detail in our paper, we introduce a framework we call dynamic fairness modeling. Dynamic fairness modeling, we argue, helps bridging the gap between given unfairness in the world found in ethical discourse and formalizations found in formal discourse. So it does so because it incorporates the following steps. First, it forces the decision maker to explicate their long-term goals in ethical terms, as opposed to a merely implicit ethical dimension of a technical choice. Second, it requires decision makers to construct a formalization that realizes these goals to a certain extent. Finally, the expected long-term effects of the suggested interventions are estimated. By following these steps, instead of evaluating fairness interventions statically and in isolation, dynamic fairness modeling prompts the decision maker to reflect on, model, and evaluate the downstream effects of any chosen decision policy. In this video, we outline the 3 steps of dynamic fairness modeling in more detail. In our full paper, we additionally illustrate the framework by the example of positive action measures in the European Union. Additionally, we present and discuss technical research that already leads in the direction of this approach. So if you are interested, we encourage you to refer to our paper. So the first element of our proposed modeling framework is an explication of the long-term goals in ethical terms, without much reference to possible formalizations. While these explications will likely refer to existing philosophical principles of fairness or justice, for example, to positions like egalitarianism or equality of opportunity, what we call ethical goals is meant to be more concrete and contextualized, especially with respect to the long-term effects of any possible intervention. The explication of a specific ethical goal should refer to a given background of structural discrimination and inequality, ideally by incorporating the specific histories and conditions that are relevant for the context of the projected decision-making system. To complement general principles, localized knowledge about racism, sexism, colonialism, or classism, etc. should play a role in the discussion of ethical goals. Additionally, these reflections should be very specific in terms of those local contexts that will be influenced and transformed by the development of an automatic decision-making system. A brief example for an ethical goal can illustrate this point. Consider the value of diversity in the assembly of teams at the workplace. A concrete manifestation of diversity may be realized by setting the goal to actively advance demographic parity between different demographic groups. This will be a matter of which groups were previously unrepresented or underrepresented and of the reasons for this inequality. A fairness intervention can then aim to help those that are structurally disadvantaged due to the local history and culture, not only by affording them opportunities, but also by helping them to successfully take advantage of these opportunities. A more detailed discussion of this example is presented in section 3 of our paper. In a second step, decision makers approximate a formalization of the previously explicated ethical goals. In a simple case, this formalization might simply correspond to one of the existing formal fairness metrics. For instance, formal equality of opportunity corresponds to the fairness metric of the same name. Ethical goals around diversity and equal representation can mathematically be expressed via the demographic parity metric. And the ethical principle to treat like cases alike, which is in many contexts required by legislation, can be addressed by the individual fairness metric. Applying existing fairness metrics in this sense is an easy way to arrive at formalizations of ethical goals. However, these goals should not always be expected to correlate to existing metrics as easily. As argued with reference to the previous step of ethical explication, our ethical goals usually require a higher level of specificity and contextualization. In particular, many ethical goals are more robustly formalized under a long-term view. The temporal perspective is important to address not only the symptoms of structural discrimination, but also the conditions that produce them. This dimension is not expressed in the standard fairness metrics, so it seems appropriate to call them static. So once the decision makers have formalized their ethical goals, in a third step, they evaluate a potential course of action. This is done by developing a mathematical model of the downstream consequences of a given decision. With reference to our example, this model should give an answer to the question if diversity measures that follow a metric of demographic parity will lead to a more diverse workforce in the long term. Of course, the quality of this model is essential for the success of the approach, so it should be based on empirical research and expert knowledge of the problem at hand. So these are the 3 steps of dynamic fairness modeling. First, explicating moral goals. Second, choosing or constructing appropriate formal metrics. And third, modeling downstream effects. Now, a main advantage of dynamic modeling lies in its explicitness and in its potential for transparency. Each of the steps corresponds to stating or formalizing assumptions in a way that can be critically discussed and/or tested. In consequence, this approach enables us to challenge underlying assumptions and mechanisms. Additionally, the approach also provides an interface for interdisciplinary collaboration between machine learning researchers, ethicists, technologists, social scientists, stakeholders, and other experts. Critically discussing the first step corresponds to the question, what are our implicit ethical goals and do we fully agree with them? Disagreeing about the underlying notion of fairness or justice corresponds to a philosophical debate with ethicists and multiple stakeholders. The second step can be evaluated by asking, does our formalization indeed capture the ethical goal we have stated? Such measurement modeling tasks are typical problems in quantitative social sciences. They can be addressed by, for example, testing whether a formalization is consistent in the sense of test-retest reliability. If the same fairness test comes out differently for similar scenarios, the operationalization in question is not robust, a sign of a poor measurement. In the third and last step, the question is, does a given fairness intervention indeed have the claimed effect in the long term? Again, this question can in principle be answered with expert knowledge and empirical data whenever the research is available. If such data is not available yet, one might decide to roll out the intervention and measure its effects within the limits of budget and ethical constraints, of course. There might be cases where we fundamentally cannot know the exact outcomes of a certain intervention in advance. In such cases, we might include our epistemic uncertainty in the model of downstream effects. In critical applications, we might decide on conservative interventions with less potential upsides but more predictable downstream effects. I want to conclude with a more general note about our thinking in the process. So, when we thought about technical solutions for problems of fairness or for questions in the fairness debates, we had the idea that it can't be a clearly technical solution only. So the technical ways of thinking about fairness and the fairness metrics are very helpful to clarify certain issues, but they are not sufficient to actually decide on the fairness intervention that is really realized in the end. So we would take a step back from the idea of a technical solution for problems of unfairness in machine learning research towards the idea of technically mediated approach to address fairness issues. So technology plays a certain role in the debate and in the discourse, but it has to work together with the ethical discourse and the perspective on values and fairness from a more general ethical perspective. Thank you very much.